Assalamu alaikum and good greetings. So today we'll be watching a video titled "What were Jesus' last word?" Question mark. Supposed Bible contradiction number 22. So yeah, for the context, feel free to look at the description box below as to why I'm watching all of this video. Without further ado, let's watch.
Suppose Bible contradiction. What were Jesus' last words on the cross? The skeptic's annotated Bible claims the Gospels contradict each other on what Jesus' last words were on the cross. Matthew and Mark say the last thing Jesus said was, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But Luke claims it was, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." But then John claims Jesus said, "It is finished." So do we have a contradiction?
Now, before going to the contradiction, that is interesting. Because when this is the word, right? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Yeah, first I would say that, well, okay, what do you understand with this? And yeah, I think from my interaction so far, I think what I can gather is Christian believe that this is the human side or human part of Jesus that is talking with, rather than the God side, I guess. Is that correct? Yeah. Here is as well, right? Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. So meaning that the one that have the power is the Father, right? And my spirit. So how to understand this as well, right? Because if Jesus is the Spirit of God, so to speak, right? Meaning that Jesus is, meaning why not your spirit or something like that. It is finished. Okay, I'm not sure this is the context, but it made me remember one of the final words of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? To indicate that he is witnessing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that his mission has been done, right? So just reading this without any context, it just triggered that it seems parallel in that sense, right? When a prophet knows that I have done my duty, you know, and they know it's time for them to go back.
No, just no. No gospel claims the phrases they recall were the only things Jesus said on the cross, and specifically the last thing he said. The Gospels only supplement each other by providing additional information, and supplementation is not equivalent to contradictions.
Meaning all of those are spoken, I guess.
Specifically, Matthew and Mark indicate when Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" That was not his last words, since bystanders mocked him afterwards and they gave him the sponge with sour wine. After which he could have uttered, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit, it is finished." Or, "It is finished," and then cried out, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." So Matthew and Mark claim the phrase they preserved happened prior to his final cry. And Luke and John both complement one another and do not actually contradict, because neither account explicitly denies what the other account says.
Now, on this point, I think many Christians have said that all of these three different accounts is just accounts of three different witnesses from three different perspectives, right? That's, I think, the general response to when something like this is asked. Why is it appear differently? The same story, the same event, but somehow this says something, this says something. So normally it's looked as three different witnessing, three different point of view, three different witness of the same event. If that is the explanation, is there any authentication done by any of these books? Because how accurate is what being perceived by some witness? For example, right, meaning that if I'm not sure how someone hear something, not hear something else, and meaning, you know, how does that happen? That's number one. Because someone, for example, the author of Luke just heard this one, John is just heard this one, not hearing. Someone else maybe at that time they're busy with their handphone. You know, I'm just wondering what is the whole concept of, the writing of this, all of this. Is it from the witness, and how come the witness in one event they witness something else and not, or they just wish to highlight this one, meaning they heard everything. But okay, I think what is important is just this I'm just telling this, it is finished. No, I don't want to, this is just keep it to myself, and the other author says this is the one that I want to highlight. So on that aspect, I just wondering how does Christians see all of this?
Jesus said a few other things while he was on the cross, so there is no a priori reason to reject that he said all these things, and possibly even more, that just wasn't written down.
Yeah, so meaning that there are something that perhaps is lost forever, right? So because if that is the case, it's meaning the whole discussion, because I have said this previously, from what I understand being claimed by the Gospels, it is the closest that it is from Islamic perspective is the Hadith, right? Meaning that something that is relayed, and there might be something that is not surviving until now, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad SAW, for example, right? Because it depends on who actually convey it and relay it to the next person.
Why can't we employ the principle of charity and accept that Jesus could have said all these things before he died?
What do you mean by could have? Meaning not everything that is being mentioned by the gospel is accepted to have happened 100%.
But if that is too inconceivable to accept, Dan Wallace points out that John's gospel is more of a dynamic equivalent transformation of what we read in the synoptics. A dynamic equivalent translation is when an author chooses not to translate the exact wording as best as possible, but instead translates in the best way to teach the general message of what is being taught. The NIV is a dynamic equivalent.
That is interesting, meaning that what is conveyed is not even hadith, it's more of lesson learned from the perspective of someone. Interesting. Do all Christians believe this, meaning that not all gospel is actually conveying as is? It's sometimes they just convey the message or the lesson learned in other words, or from their perspective, or a simpler words. Because hadith, you convey it as is, unless you just convey the lesson, meaning that I have seen, I have heard, I have learned, right? But when it's like a quote, it has to be a quote. You cannot have a quote, Prophet says this, but that the word itself you have already turn into something else just to convey the message. You cannot do that.
Equivalent translation, translating into English in a way as to teach the message, whereas the ESV is more of a formal translation, trying to get closer to the exact wording that was given.
So all of this appear to be more of not really tafsir, but because we have the translation, the Quran translation, that is already embedded elements of tafsir, right? It's not literal translation, because for those who are not aware of the culture, etc., back then, literal translation might just go over your head and what's going on. So it's like a contextual translation or something, meaning that you have embedded the element of tafsir in translation. And I think many translation of the Quran is using that approach, because otherwise some some phrases, etc., just literally being translated, then people will not understand, okay, what is this all about?
Wallace points out the Gospel of John is more of a dynamic equivalence into Greek, whereas the Synoptics are probably more formal translations. Every time we read of thirst in
What does formal translation mean? Is it literal translation, or is it something else?
John, it carries the meaning of being devoid of God's Spirit.
Okay, I don't understand
Wallace
that.
suggests in John, when Jesus says, I thirst, it is a dynamic equivalent of the same line in Matthew and Mark. This could also be what John is doing when he records that Jesus said, it is finished. It could just be a dynamic equivalence of what Luke says he uttered before he died. So even if a skeptic thinks it is impossible for Jesus to have said all these phrases on the cross, it could just be the case that John is creating a dynamic equivalence of what Jesus said. So since this is the case, there really is no contradiction to begin with.
So that's interesting, meaning that, is there any study or any sources that Christians actually look up to see whether, okay, I was going to ask whether this is like a dynamic, is it dynamic translation or something what he said, but then I remembered that Christians actually don't believe it is that important to have the literal or the exact thing, exact speech, exact words, because what is important is just the message, underlying message, right? I think that's what Christians always remind me of, that do not always compare to the hadith or the Quran, because it's totally different. It's more of like a seerah, right? So meaning in Islam you have the Quran, hadith, and then seerah, right? So it's here. Do not push it to the level of hadith, what more to the Quran, because if you push it to that level, you require certain stringent test or requirement, and of course you will see it as something that falter. But if you put it in the level of seerah, in seerah you don't, you paraphrase, you just convey something from the perspective of an observer, etc. It's not a problem. Anyway, so that's my take on it. Thank you for watching. See you next time.